Have had time to look at Joshua chapter 8. How many of you have come to an answer in your own mind on that?
Answer, but reason why.
Okay, you know the account. We don't have to really go over the account, although we're going to have to use our Bibles for that later on. We have an attack on the city of Ai, the second one. This one is successful. The first one was not successful. And Joshua has a certain battle plan that he follows. And of course he follows it to victory. The children of Israel overcome the inhabitants of the city of Ai. Of course our question would be there in that passage, did Joshua do what was right? Was something like the battle plan he used, was that approved of God? Was that allowed? So let's see your hands on that. Who thinks that Joshua, we've gone back and forth. We found some people who are right and some people who are wrong. And last time we had to make Samuel right because God told him to do it. So that was fairly easy in that regard. But how many of you feel that Joshua was right in what he did? Okay, how many of you feel that he was wrong in what he did? Now, some people didn't raise their hands. Whoever didn't raise their hand, still the vast majority, even if you all raise your hand on the opposite side instead of the I don't know side, the vast majority feels that Joshua did what was right. Is that what I said, that you all responded? I guess I'm a little surprised on that. Who didn't raise their hand? Okay, that's still several people, but even if you all agreed on that side, you still wouldn't overthrow the other side, though. Now, you didn't raise your hand because you're not certain. You see it both ways, how it could be both ways.
I see a verse that says, God set an ambush behind the city. And so that's what I see on the fence.
Okay.
And then 18 says for God told him to raise the javelin to signal the ambush. It's kind of like he's following them through.
Okay.
The Lord is party to the plan. I think that's for us our overwhelming thesis. He says, set an ambush behind the city. He tells them to do it.
Okay, but I guess we're talking about two different parts of the plan. One was set an ambush, and one was a feigned retreat. You could set an ambush without a feigned retreat. Now, I don't know that we have an extremely difficult passage here. The commentators and the writers that I have perused for this Joshua 8 passage have been, without exception, on one side of the question. And I think that would be fairly easy to see and to guess which side of the question they're on. I haven't found any exceptions to that. So it seems like there's a consensus of opinion over the fact that, in fact, what Joshua does here was allowed of God, approved of God, and maybe someone goes so far as to say that God's party to the strategy involved, although not all would say that. Some would just say that God approved of this. And someone goes so far as to say that he's party to the strategy.
I'll bring up what my question was, why
Okay.
I'm undecided, is because Joshua uses the tactic of pretending that they're beaten. I think the writer he said in the SB said they pretended to be beaten and then they retreat. And to me that was untruthful. He could have set an ambush and gone in, brought the men out of the city to come and attack them out in the field, and the men could have come in from behind and attacked instead of drawing them, fleeing like they were beaten, and drawing them away.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I'll say to that.
it still seems like there's enough uncertainty to do what I wanted to do this morning. Maybe those of you who are on the undecided position would become convinced of the other side enough to take that side. What I want to do is divide up, stop now publicly, and divide up and give you about 10 or 15 moments together in a group, with one side believing Joshua is okay in what he does, and another side believing that he is definitely wrong. He committed a moral evil here. And be able to have your arguments ready and know what your adversaries, that is the other group's arguments, are going to be against yours, and have proofs against all of that then, and choose a spokesman from the two groups to defend your position. This kind of should culminate all that we've been looking at thus far, to teach you how to think about these things, to look at the pertinent material here. We even have more people coming in back there. Maybe they'll join the other side then. Maybe those are some opponents of Joshua there. Some fugitives from Ai. Well, I did overhear enough toward the end of what people's statements and arguments were as you divided up into some groups, and I find it very amusing because the situation is very straightforward as far as I'm concerned. But let's see how we go. Now, you're and who? You on this side? At least at one time, for certain, we're going to be guaranteed that one of those guys will be right. They're both always wrong. So one of them's going to win now.
After I win, that's going to say, see, I was on that side to start with.
Well, let's start with the majority side then, and tell us why we don't have a problem here.
Well, I guess we got eight points here, but the basic 2 points that we pointed out was, the first point would be that the Lord is definitely siding with Joshua on the strategy, because he speaks in, he talks till verse 2, and the last thing he says is, set an ambush against the city. And
behind the city.
Or behind the city. And if he doesn't, if he didn't give the rest of the details, just to set men behind the city is not an ambush. He needs more details to make it an ambush.
We have already determined that the Lord can determine the outcome without having to determine the means. And there's no explicit statement saying that Joshua should use diversionary tactics in addition to the ambush.
But that doesn't hold any water, because God wouldn't even tell him about the ambush then. If he already knew the outcome, he would have had to reveal something.
They could have still have won the battle by planning an ambush without having to make the victory so complete as to draw out all the people by using a feigned retreat.
You're saying that Joshua didn't have faith in God, telling him that
No, but he would have less of a difficulty taking the city
by what?
by feigning a retreat. He's a general, he's going to use strategy involved, but I don't think necessarily that he had to use all that much strategy. He could have relied more on the Lord.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so far this side has ordered, the Lord is on their side because he plans the ambush. And they're saying, well, that's all that it said, is God planned the ambush. He didn't plan anything else besides that, just the ambush. This side says, but why have an ambush if you're not going to have a feigned retreat? Some type of retreat, an ambush would serve no purpose. This side says, well, yes, it could. You could not have a feigned retreat, still have an ambush. I guess you mean bring the people out to fight, start fighting, and then ambush. You don't have to feign a retreat.
But then the Lord seems to be right in on it when he, in verse 18, he says, okay, Joshua, lift up your javelin so the ambush can come up. So it seems like he's right in there on the strategy, right in there on the plan. Because if the Lord didn't suggest the ambush and then the retreat, why would he say, okay, this is time for the ambush to come out?
So he's jumping from 2 to 18 and say these are connected then. That we don't really have a mention of God involving himself in the retreat, but we've got the 2nd verse and the 18th verse that both speak of the ambush.
Right.
Neither one of those, I don't think, really speaks of any retreat. Hold out the javelin. Well, that would be to those in ambush. So we've got 2 verses here, the Lord on their side because of the ambush. So what about that? What do those 2 verses prove?
Well, that they prove that the ambush is very successful and very effective because they were drawn away from the city. But the ambush.
Is he proving too much with those verses?
Yeah, he's assuming the fact that he's just assuming that the Lord is
party to the feigned retreat.
It doesn't say there. And we're saying ambush. The Lord could use an ambush without having to use the retreat.
Okay. So is the ambush, is the fact that God seems to be on Joshua's side, is that one of the biggest things you think is in your favor?
I thought so. I'm not sure
Okay.
if that was a unanimous.
Okay, what's another point besides the ambush then?
Another point that we picked out is that we thought the ambush, the retreat was more or less like the man hiding in the well, where they didn't. The confusion was in the minds of the men of Ai, not in. They're the ones that assumed, that they had the upper hand and to go out completely and attack them. It was all left in their mind.
Our counter to that is that it was not a passive strategy like the hiding, but active misrepresentation.
Well,
Laura wrote this.
To change that point, misrepresentation would be misrepresentation whether it was active or passive. If you, I guess I have to get an example of passive misrepresentation.
No, you don't have to, just go to another point.
Okay.
We can bring forth a point.
Okay.
In the KJV, it says, it doesn't use, we realize that NIV makes a very neutral way of stating the fact that they allow themselves to be pushed back, which doesn't have the hint of moral guilt or anything, but the KJV uses made as if it was, definitely pretending, misrepresenting the things. They made, in chapter 8, verse 15, Joshua and all Israel made as if they were beaten before them. Now, obviously, they weren't being beaten. They made as if. And the NASB, we are told, has pretended in that passage.
Well, the NIV is fairly strong too. Joshua and all Israel let themselves be driven back. It's essentially the same. So that almost sounds like the chief point you're going to have to deal with here is duplicity. It's a feigned retreat. It's pretension. It's misrepresentation. It's deceitful. It's go back to your definition of a lie. It's an action done with the intention of deceit.
And we could use, there are things about the ambush, we could use that as already an effective means, maybe not as effective without the added strategy, but we can use those things as saying, well, the Lord has obviously determined, but maybe Joshua is just not using using,
Right, okay, so they said that you have to have an ambush, and you say not necessarily. So you have to have a retreat to make the ambush worth anything.
right.
You're saying that you could use their ambush points without having to fall for a feigned retreat. So this seems to be the biggest argument over here. The biggest one on this side so far is the fact that the Lord's party to it. But it's a little, we have an argument over how much of their plans was the Lord party to. And then on this side, their biggest fault is the fact that it was feigned.
Okay, now, if we take chapter 7 in consideration also.
Okay.
Chapter 8, in chapter 7, one man sinned, and they lost the battle at Ai. So it would seem to me that if Joshua was sinning in chapter 8 by pretending that they would not win the battle.
Amen.
That's really poor, because the Lord says, the Lord says the city is there, so it wouldn't matter. I mean, the Lord has given them the city. This is an Ai. It wasn't predetermined that the Lord was going to give them the city then, at that time. And He says, at this time, you're going to take the city now. So,
I think the whole promise that we see in the Pentateuch is, I'm going to give you a land flowing with milk and honey.
That was a promise before they came
Yeah. He gave them conditions that Jericho, nothing was supposed to be taken, and somebody did. If they hadn't, I'm sure I would have fallen the first time.
And to go back to their point 4, I think that in verse 6, that Joshua here is stating facts on what will happen. That if they act like they're retreating, that the people of Ai will be drawn out of the city. Thus, he's stating a fact. I don't know.
A fact that he's got to carry out before it's a fact, though.
I suppose. I guess that's not winning here, huh?
There was another case that was similar to this where, that was back in, I can't think where it was, but, to the fact that, it was in Jeremiah, where he didn't give all the, God doesn't, or we don't, the writer here didn't give us all the details that were given to God. I mean, given from God to Joshua. But we see all the details that God gave Joshua about the ambush from verse 3 through, I believe, verse 6 or 7, somewhere in there. And that's where we get the details of the ambush.
So we're going to assume that God may have told him about the feigned retreat also?
Right.
But then the statement,
but how can you use that as an argument to assume that?
okay, that's
Because
like,
he wasn't required then to give all the information as we see it given here now. The writer didn't give all the information. Joshua, when he wrote this, didn't give all the information because he's going to give it anyway when he's telling his people.
Isn't that
So
not an
then-
argument from silence, though? I mean, in a sense. I mean, you're using a comparison, but we could find, can't we find a
Yeah, that can be called an argument from silence. But not necessarily, though.
well, it's like last Sunday. Last Sunday, he was told to sacrifice first, then to anoint second. God could have told him to go out, fight, and lure back. In other words, lure him out of the city. Not that they're being deceptive, that's one way to bring him out of the city. Joshua could have said, well, then they'll think we're losing. That could have been just Joshua's statement, where God said, lure him out, and Joshua, just thought. It's like Samuel thought, well, he'll kill me. Well, God's first thought was the sacrifice, and his second thought was the anointing. So it's kind of like an afterthought, well, they'll think we're losing, but actually it's like having two armies, one in the plains and one in the mountains. Your best bet is to get them on the mountains, so you give them more room to fight in the plains and have them come after you. You're not saying that you're losing, but you're backing off to get more room to get everybody on the plains to make the fighting even.
Okay, in the 1 Samuel 16, we're saying that God's first thought was to go and sacrifice him while they're anointed king.
Right.
All right, now what are we saying here in Joshua 8? God's first thought is what? Feigned
Just to
retreat?
Lure them out of the city.
Okay.
But not thinking, and it just happens that they'll think that they're losing again. But the thought,
Okay.
just
I just wanna
militarily,
make
he's
sure.
saying, get them out of the
Understand what you're
city.
saying.
And just the second thought was Joshua's, well, then they'll think we're losing.
Okay, so she says the first thought that in God's mind is a feigned retreat then. Is that similar to 1 Samuel 16, that God's first thought there was a sacrifice?
No, because Samuel was told and commanded that, so Samuel has no choice in the matter. Joshua, we're arguing that it's not necessarily told of Joshua to feign the retreat. If he were told, then obviously, it would be up to God.
But setting up the ambush could indicate the fact that he was told to do the rest. Again, the ambush would not be of any effect unless they got all the men out of the city.
I hope everyone in the back can hear the arguments and the flow of thought up here.
I think we have a similar case here, we're just not given all the details, and like in the case last week, we had to turn around a few things in order for it to, we certainly know God didn't lie, so we have to understand it from that point of view, and I think the same thing is somewhat true here, because if, I think as one of our points, if there was a sin committed by Joshua in order to win this battle, they certainly would not have won it.
Do we
I think that would be certainly
Is that true?
good proof.
They committed a sin because their earlier argument, I believe, was they committed a sin in the battle before. Right, and that's why they lost
We've
that.
seen results happen from even.
But we've seen results
simple
like in Abraham's case, even when they did sin. We've seen
That's
results.
right. So they could have been morally deceptive, but that's an act of man.
And God could still have given them the victory, but he didn't do that in the preceding chapter.
What if the people of Ai, the leaders of Ai, have a responsibility to lead people back to protect their city? It was through their
We would
greed
might
and
hope they would do
their
that.
stupidity that they, all the fighting men went out of the city. That it
Okay, so
wasn't
they're
because of-
capitalizing on their stupidity, but who created their stupidity though?
Right.
I think the previous, they created that themselves by
being
winning the-
overconfident.
by overconfidence from the previous battle, and now they're overconfident. They're gonna annihilate Israel.
Okay.
And in their greed and lust to annihilate that nation once and for all, they took out after them, and they lost the battle.
We're not arguing that it was an effective strategy and also that they're taking advantage of stupidity or whatever, but they're using a strategy, and we're arguing that part of that strategy was pretense. It was
what?
feigned.
I think the deception was on Ai's part, not on Joshua's. It was just plain confusion on Ai's part.
We gave them a temptation and they took it.
Confused or not, they're led to believe that Israel is being beaten as before.
They didn't have to though. You can pull yourself back to give more room, and still not be
Well, were they
giving the
pulling
idea
back to give themselves more room?
to get the men out of the city.
Well, then it's more than pulling back to give themselves room. It's pulling out to draw them out.
That's right.
Well, you can still, that's like drawing someone out of the mountain. It doesn't mean you're losing, it just means you're backing up to bring them out. They're not gonna stand there sometimes and wait, they wanna come and fight you.
But Marie, it says we will lure them out of
Yeah.
the city. They were
And they were made as if they were beaten as
get in
before.
the city and get in the city.
But
But the size of number of army Joshua had at that time in front of the city.
It's hard to recognize hands this morning. Just jump in. Everyone's talking.
Do you
It was
have
so
to have
great
a
for
lure
the men of,
to have an ambush?
Pardon?
Do you have to lure to have an ambush?
Do you have to lure to have an ambush?
You can wait for somebody to go by.
That's right, that's
Right,
that's
but
a
what's the chance of the city going by?
Well, it says here in verse 14 that they already were hurrying out and they weren't lured out quite yet.
In other words, what she's arguing is the second point right here. The ambush is fine, but you don't need to feign the retreat. They're already coming out.
Yeah, they hurried out.
I just wanted to try to justify the Feigned Retreat. Two things that come to my mind about why I feel Joshua could be justified in the way he, the way he acted. In
Okay,
his strategy.
what are those two things then?
Okay. Number one.
Number one?
Is that he never did tell them that he was giving up. It doesn't say that he told the enemy that, he's retreating, he's giving up, and he's quitting the battle. But the enemy may have been more than what he could have done, and he was retreating so that he could weaken the enemy and tire the enemy out in strength, in supplies, and in cutting off the supplies, the ambush was going to take care of that.
So then the retreat is not a feigned one at all. He had to retreat.
Yeah, that's one possibility.
Okay.
He had to, in order to defeat the enemy.
Okay.
Supplies.
And what's the second point
The
then?
other thing I was going to say is,
Okay, someone else can jump in. If he thinks of it, he can come back with that one then. Many points to keep in your mind. Now they've just left Brother Captain back here. They've left you in the dust now. You've been silent now for 15 minutes.
Thinking.
Did that? You're switching sides. Is what you're doing. Benedict Arnold.
I'm thinking it is moral deception on part of Joshua.
Okay.
Why?
Why? Just because it obviously says that they practice a feigned retreat?
Well, they wanted to conquer the city of Ai, so they had to be morally deceptive to do that.
Well, they were commanded to conquer the city of Ai.
Yeah, but what if
And kill everyone.
they would have went to the city and
They
waited
had
for
to do,
more
they had to
instructions
do.
from the Lord? What if they would have went to the city and waited for more instructions from the Lord instead of going there to fight and then retreating?
Well, the
And then the
Lord
Lord
told
told
them
them to raise the staff to get the other
Well,
bunch of guys.
Presupposes though that he didn't have all the instructions already.
and we could go to some of the accounts where God said angels to kill a whole city or a whole army, such as how many? 120,000,
185.
185,000, and Israel didn't have to do anything.
So if that's the case, why did Joshua have to fake a retreat? Why couldn't he just depend on the Lord's ambush?
Maybe he was depending on the Lord's ambush. That was what he was told to
He
do.
was told to ambush, so he did. I believe
In order
that.
to fake the retreat.
To argue that, Laura, I think our point of all the instructions being given to Joshua in chapter, or in verse 1 and 2, and then Joshua disclosing all the instructions from there on about the whole, how the battle was going to take place.
I don't think
was
you can
from
say
God.
that the Lord told him to act out a fake retreat, because it doesn't say that. That's adding to the scripture. He did
Okay,
tell
so
him
they're
to set up an
gonna
ambush.
say on the basis of our study earlier that we could assume something like that would happen. So even if we could assume that there was other information given to Joshua besides what we have here, I think the argument on this side would still be we can assume as much information as we want, but we could never assume any moral evil.
Right.
For God to tell Samuel to go sacrifice, to go sacrifice is the first command, is just go sacrifice. But for him to say, go lure them away as his first command, and then give ambush later, lure away is an entirely different thing than sacrifice. Sacrifice doesn't imply moral evil or anything. Luring away possibly does, even if we want to assume information.
Can we say that Joshua's just using war tactics?
We can say that. We can go back to Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill, that in times of war, truth is so precious she must be attended by a bodyguard of lies.
Right.
What about this, if you use another word instead of lure, he tempted them out of the city. God tempts no man, he tries them. Would God have been party to a strategy that tempted them out of the city? No.
We're not dealing with it morally, it's not a moral temptation, it's just leading.
All right, then, if we want to use that argument,
God's not involved with this war, God's not involved with anything to do with the battle. because God just gave,
He ambushed them.
God gave him command to conquest the land,
Uh-huh.
and he told them,
Totally annihilate all
told
the
them to
people.
annihilate all the pagans. Okay, that's what he told them to
So
do.
he's parting to
As
the
humans, we have to go about it in whatever way we have to go about it. And that's
And you
killing
would-
them, that's
Yeah, but
killing
to
them.
Are you in favor of?
No, I
I'm
think she's
saying
on the
both,
opposite.
I'm saying he's more.
Oh, she's
that's
saying
what
both.
He has to kill him. He has to kill him to, I mean, how else can you use any strategy if you're gonna kill him? I mean.
I hope we don't embarrass people through all of this, you know, as we get through it, and your mouth was the loudest, and then you find out that you were wrong. It's a way to learn. It's just a way to learn.
Amen.
Well, if you take, if you take the whole works under consideration, where the men of the city, we must spend about 25,000 men in front of the city, 5,000 in ambush.
Okay, that's what I wanted someone to do. Let's get some figures here.
Then total in Ahai, there was 12,000 men
600,000.
and women.
They start off with like 30,000, right? He makes a division between 5 and 25.
That's 5 in ambush, must spend 25 in front of the city then.
Okay.
When Ahai came out, well, it says men and women of 12,000, so what, say 6,000 men, fighting men, say, that'd be probably high.
Oh, very
You know,
much so.
So the confusion and foolishness for 25,000 fighting men in front of the city to turn around and start backing up, and for the king of Ahai to think that he's conquering them. I mean, there's a problem there. And then for him to empty out the city, that's just plain foolishness. And also was done, God mentioned about the ambush, told Joshua to set the ambush, to turn around for a purpose. God promised them the belongings, the cattle, and the spoil of the city, whereas if they would have seized the city and fought the city, they would have destroyed that too.
For the continuation of the
God promised them the belongings, the cattle, and the spoil of the city, whereas if they would have seized the city and fought the city, they would have destroyed that too. The reward, the nation of Israel's reward from that city.
Okay, on that side, could we not argue something like this? Joshua chapter 8. Do we have a problem here? It was a strategic retreat. Israel was under no obligation to tell everyone why. Joshua was taking advantage of the people of Ai's unwariness and lack of scouting. The deception arose from Ai failing to recognize that Israel's retreat was in fact strategic. It would be a misunderstanding to think that in all cases the Christian must make certain that all parties involved precisely understand the relevant information in the same way. That would be kind of how I think those people would, the pro people would argue their side. Why don't we do it like this then? We'll erase this sign.
Dave, you're on the right side.
And I will argue this side. Okay, now tell me what your problems are, and let me see how I would answer them then. This side again.
Verse 18, where it says that the Lord spoke that second time, and he said, hold out toward Ai the javelin. He doesn't say, okay, now do your ambush.
Okay, but I think we would assume that that's what the sign was for. They're probably far enough away, several hundred yards now, that they've got to see something, probably a javelin,
Okay.
maybe with some type of standard hooked to it, like a flag or something, to
That would
alert
be our
them.
first problem, though, would be that the Lord seems to be part of the strategy.
All right, then my argument would be, as they've already argued, a lot of mine would be very similar. That in no shape or form are we told anything here about God having anything to say about the feigned retreat. That all he says is the ambush.
But
But-
then we go to our second point, that in order to have an ambush, you have to have them go past it.
And we would say not necessarily, because they're not past it anyway. It's on the opposite side of the city from which they're going to be going. And we do have in Israel 500,000 fighting men. And we are told here in the 3rd verse that Joshua selected some of the best of the fighting men, 30,000 of them. And he put 5,000 on one side of the city. It was a northwest type of deal, not actually opposite east, west, or north, south, a northwest type deal. We put 5,000 men there. 25,000 men actually came right up to the city, up very close to it, and they were going to fight. As soon as the people came out of the city, the ambush could climb the walls on the opposite side, set the city on fire, because when you're busy fighting out in front of your gates, you're not looking behind you. You wouldn't have needed to retreat at all. The city would be on fire, they'd turn around and see it burning, and that'd be the end of them right then.
Okay, then what about the luring away, that their lack of scouting and their confusion, thinking they're beating 25,000 men?
Okay, in the earlier chapter 7, they sent like 2,000 or 3,000 against them, and I slew about 36 of those men. They just annihilated them. 25,000 men would be a lot of men coming against a city like Ai. Therefore, why in the world would you need any type of feigned retreat? Surely your 25,000 men plus your 5,000 ambushment could conquer the city.
I think he did it in obedience to God.
All right, where would God tell him to do that?
Well, I go back to my argument to begin with, where we aren't given all the details until verse 3.
All right.
And then he discloses the details of the ambush that God told him in verse 1. He just didn't give us the whole account.
Okay, so we're hooked up on our 1 Samuel 16 example there, that we could have something that maybe was given or thought of in the mind of God that was not given to the military leader here, or at least not given to him until later, and we find out about it later. But the big problem with that was the thing that was given, though. 1 Samuel 16, it's fine if we reverse those things, go sacrifice, and while there anoint a king, instead of, as we read it, go anoint a king, and while there pretend that you're really not by offering a sacrifice, because there's nothing morally wrong, right or left, hot or cold with sacrifice. But if God said, I want you to pretend as though you're defeated, and lure the people out of the city, that's a feigned retreat. And that's an action calculated to deceive.
But then, going back to the Jeremiah case, and I can't recall exactly what that was, but Jeremiah didn't give all the details either.
Okay.
Jeremiah.
That was a past tense conversation.
Right.
He went back and picked out of it certain things that he wanted them to hear and not others. Whereas in this case, we've got a future tense thing as far as Joshua's mind is concerned, what he's planning here. We would go down to about the third or fourth point here, and our activity versus our passivity in a case like this. As far as the well is concerned and the roof are concerned, they just went down in there, and it's a passive type involvement. Nothing was planned. Then you capitalize on the fact that they don't look around enough. But you didn't lead them to think anything but two things. Either you're not there or you are there and you're hiding. Would be the only two things they could think. And it'd be up to them to pick which of those two things they want to think. Either the person is not here or they're here and they're hiding. Whereas in a case like Joshua 8, it's a very active manifestation of leading the people away from the city.
Brother, what other way could you describe the ambush that Joshua performed behind the city that God instructed him to do without, luring the people out of the city and then capturing it? How else could you define or describe that he could ambush that city behind it?
Well, I think I've already done that once, and it's very easy. The people are obviously overconfident. They have won a relatively easy victory in the chapter before. They're obviously overconfident. They are going to come out, probably if they had all 500,000 men, and they're going to do some fighting. They're going to get outside of the gates of the city as you look down in verses 10 through 13. And while they're outside the front of the city fighting, then the ambushment goes over the wall in the back and sets the city on fire. Notice it was not like this type of ambushment that Scott's talking about. Let's say we have our city here, and let's put it on the opposite side so it makes more sense to us. Here's the ambushment back here. Here are the gates to the city. All right, Israel comes in like this. The people come out like this. It's not a situation where the ambushment is over here Israel's going to come in and then going to reverse and go back. Ai's going to follow Israel out, so these men come in behind and cut them off. They're actually behind the city. They got to set the city on fire first. Once they set the city on fire, they come right out the front gates and then come out here. In other words, if we had an ambushment here, it's seeming like you'd want to draw the people, and then you could argue that God wanted them to put the ambushment there. Because if the ambushment here is here, you have to have them drawn past a certain point.
Right.
If the ambushment's back here, you don't need to draw them anywhere except out of the front of the city.
But I still think we're leaving out the fact that God commanded them to kill all those people in that city.
Well, that's fine. But we cannot use moral wrong to kill them by, though. No deception. It's impossible for him to practice any deceit or lying.
Is Joshua then working in discouragement and fear and not being able to do it, but he did it his way?
Oh, I would say he did it his way. I don't know what his motives were, but I would say he did it his way. And then what would be your argument against that? Because you've used it before. You'd say, well, but wait a minute, in the chapter before they sinned and they lost the battle.
Right.
But that chapter before, you really have to go a chapter before that. That battle of Jericho was the monumental battle. That was the battle that symbolized their coming into the land. And unlike any of the other episodes, God said, all the spoils belong to me. It was a first fruits offering unto the Lord based on the Levitical laws. And therefore to have violated that, as did Achan, well then that just ruins their covenant standing with God until that is put aright again. Therefore, we can jump into chapter 8 and have Joshua and his men sin in the way they do it. God still gives them the victory. We go back to a case like Abraham, where God would give them blessing even though they sinned. That earlier chapter 6 really is a unique episode there of the conquering of the city of Jericho. Because we've got many examples, as we've looked already, of how David feigned himself to be mad, and yet God still allowed him to be preserved through that into escape, and he goes on to praise God for the escape. See, our big problem with this is the fact we have a feigned retreat. That's the problem with the chapter here, is we have a feigned retreat. We obviously have actions done that are planned ahead. They anticipate the fact that they will be successful. These actions will cause these other people to be deceived. And it's just so obvious and so blatant. What other arguments do you have then? That's taking care of most of these so far.
Wouldn't any type of ambush be deceived?
Pardon? Okay, ambushment's hiding. You could hide under the trees on the other side of the city.
So what's the difference if it caused them to come out of the gate a little further than they normally would? Past that point, they had to draw them out of the gate anyway.
Yeah, and all you got to do is just come right here. And they came out.
But God told them
Right,
to
you
hide
had to get them out.
That's right.
You had to lure them out.
Yeah, and look at verse 11. The entire force that was with him marched up, approached the city, arrived in front of it. They set up camp north of Ai, with the valley between them and the city. Joshua had taken about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai to the west of the city. They had the soldiers take up their positions, all those in the camp. That night Joshua went to the valley. Verse 14, the next morning. When the king of Ai saw this, saw 25,000 men with Joshua out in front of the city. He and all the men of the city hurried out early in the morning to meet Israel in battle at a certain place.
So it's already.
They're already coming out of the city.
Yeah.
So what makes it different is if you are not defeated, you can withdraw if your lines are exhausted, if you need more rations, if you need more men, and you're fighting in a battle, you have all the right in the world to withdraw. But if you know you're winning, you know you can win, you know you're going to win, and you say, but we're going to pretend like we're not for an hour or two, and we're going to hightail it over the hill, then you're obviously lying to the people, lying in action.
All right. Then, if we're going to make it a moral issue here, then let's take up the moral issue with God telling Joshua to kill all the people.
Oh, that's one I don't think we want to get into. I heard that in the other group, as a matter of fact. The whole business about killing here.
Well, since the pendulum seems to have swung towards he did not do anything wrong, what about, or he did something wrong, I mean, and what about if you were hand-to-hand combat and you were just basically making as if you were retreating before the other person, and that person falls into a pit because you drew him back. Now,
if it's a feigned retreat, it's feigned. If you want to retreat and get to gather your senses, to gather your strength, you're under no obligation not to be able to do that. You're free to retreat anytime, any way you want to. You're losing energy, you're losing men. Otherwise, every time you go into a battle, you better be sure you're going to win, because you can't retreat. But to feign the retreat, it's a feigned retreat.
Why are we using feigned retreat rather than strategic retreat?
Because strategic implies that we don't have a moral evil here. Whereas when we get down to verses 15 and 16, Joshua and all Israel let themselves be driven back before them. They fled toward the desert. All the men of Ai were called to pursue them. They pursued Joshua and were lured away from the city. And then you get down in verses 20 through 23 and you have it again there. But obviously it was a feigned retreat. Strategic is one of those nice diplomatic, amoral terms to use.
Well, out of curiosity, we're talking, that one's, we got the ambush to the south of the city.
Yeah.
Actually, it was to the west of the city.
Yeah.
Now, probably to assume though, most likely if they drew them right out in front of the city, the fighting would have been right there, and that would have been the only gate to the city open. That would have been the only vulnerable point of the city. So actually, strategically, they would have had to bring them away from the city in order for the ambush to really be effective without just...
Well, I don't think they have to go in the gate. The city's empty. They go right over the wall.
yeah, they didn't go in the gate.
I'm sure
because
the
probably
reason the
a
Lord
gatekeeper.
has it a north and west type deal is probably due to the terrain around there more than anything else. And we don't know what the terrain around the city of Ai was. It's hard to even find where the authentic site of the ancient city of Ai really was. I don't think they come in through the gate. They probably just go right over the wall. We don't know that either. But this is not a big city. I mean, it's only got a few men there. It's not a big city like Jericho. Jericho was a stronghold in the area. See, regardless of whether the men should have left some people behind or didn't leave people behind, that's all not relevant to the fact that the retreat is a feigned retreat. And I know I'm going contrary to anything I've ever read on this before. But I cannot get away from the fact that they are actively deceiving the people. They're not just capitalizing on someone else's misunderstanding. They are creating the misunderstanding. There's a big difference between capitalizing on misunderstanding someone else has and fostering that in their mind to begin with.
In other words, you're saying that there would have been a difference if, say, Joshua would have approached with just 3,000 men as before, or less. So actually, they would have been being beaten back.
Maybe they would have, but you see, now they've got the strength of the Lord on their side. God had promised them that one of you will put to flight 110, 1,000. They probably could have come with 100 men and defeated. You see, God set an ambush, but why does Joshua have to bring 25,000 men? You know, notice God doesn't give us any figures here. He sets 5,000 men behind and 25,000 in front and then lures them away. I'm not going to even make an attempt because it would be extra biblical and I'm sure spurious to try to read into Joshua's mind what's going on here. But he certainly cried out to the Lord in chapter 7, and then God actually tells him what's the first thing here, do not be afraid. In chapter 8, he probably says do not be afraid because Joshua is afraid. And just because God gives us a command doesn't mean that we always perform it, though. Why would he say, do not be afraid, unless Joshua is still afraid? He has no reason to. You see, it's almost like Joshua was overconfident in the fact that we are the Lord's people, and whatever we do will prosper. And whenever he saw that little scenario ruined back in chapter 7, whenever they were defeated, Now it's just demoralized him. So he brings up this large group of people, choosing out, verse 3, he chose 30,000 of his best fighting men against this little town of Ai. That's hardly necessary. If we're going to read anything into anyone, it may need to be read into Joshua, and not into the elders of the city of Ai, who probably were stupid for emptying their whole city.
He said that when they came to the city and they were fighting the city, they were already starting to come out of the city. So he didn't have to, retreat. He could have, after they finally, sooner or later, they all came out of the city and they would have been fighting. And they could have defeated over the wall.
Exactly. See, that's what we're clearly told there in verse 14. They hurried out early in the morning to meet Israel, and Israel could have just slaughtered them. See, the 1 Samuel 16 type of thinking to maybe assume, well, if we've got a problem, and we know that God told Samuel to do that, and so if we think we might have a problem with that, then it's when you might want to use that framework of thinking and try to rearrange the order of it. But even in rearranging the order of it, we can end up with a moral evil check on God's side of the ledger, though. We're here, if we're assuming that is a moral evil, and that's what we've been saying about lying the whole time, that anything that you do, anything that you say with the intent to actively deceive someone else is wrong, according to Scripture. It's both wrong for us and wrong for God, because Satan is the father of all liars. And see, Joshua had so much on his side here anyway. God's already promised the victory. God did say set an ambush. That's the way God wanted it done. He didn't always tell us why. I don't know why he had to march around Jericho 7 times versus 6, or why march at all. I'm sure they could have overcome. He could have given them legs like grasshoppers. They could have leaped over the wall into the city, so many things. But God chose to set an ambush behind the city. But as far as the numbers of the men and then the strategy later employed by Joshua, that's something else entirely as far as I'm concerned.